Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Kenny. I'm the Wesley W. Posfer Chair in International Security Studies and the Director of the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies at Pitt's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. I'm also your host for today. On behalf of our two moderators for today's panel, Dr. Taylor Siebold, Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Ford Institute for Human Security, and Ms. Geraldine Pacheco, a second-year master's student in Public and International Affairs at GISPIA, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Dr. Errol Henderson's research talk, White Supremacism and World Politics, Present at the Creation, Persistent to Today. Dr. Henderson is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Pennsylvania State University. He has written widely and taught widely on this and many other topics related to international relations, including, but certainly not limited to, ethnic conflict and nationalism, religion and war and world politics, and the democratic peace theory. He is the author of more than 40 scholarly publications, including 5 books. Recently, he has published 2 new books, one on the Black liberation struggle of the 1960s and 70s, that's called The Revolution Will Not Be Theorized, and another on the role of religion in international relations. That's titled Scriptures, Shrines, Scapegoats, and World Politics. Both these books are published by university presses, but they're also free online through the Tome Initiative. Dr. Henderson is not just a scholar, he's an active member of his community. For example, Dr. Henderson is an original co-sponsor of the Liberation film series at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. He's also a member of numerous professional, academic, and activist organizations. He is a veteran of the United States Army, and he has spoken out on the challenges of confronting white supremacism in academia. Today, Dr. Henderson will speak on his research on white supremacism and world politics, which he has published in several academic journal articles, including Hidden in Plain Sight from the Cambridge Review of International Affairs and The Revolution Will Not Be Theorized from Millennium. We've posted links to electronic copies of both these articles on our website. Pitt folks can also find the links on the Pitt Read Green advert that went out last week. In addition to today's public research presentation, Dr. Henderson will address the Graduate School in Public and International Affairs in 2 private sessions. On Wednesday, November 4th, Dr. Henderson will address GISPIA's faculty and staff about being the only tenured African-American professor in the Department of Political Science at Penn State, and about recruiting Black students into Penn State's PhD program, something that he has a lot of experience with. We are delighted that that private talk will be hosted by GISPIA's new dean, Professor Carissa Slaughterback. Carissa has told me how excited she is by Dr. Henderson's virtual visits to GISPIA. Also, later in the semester, Dr. Henderson will be addressing GISPIA students in a professional development session, and he's also going to be mentoring some of our students one-on-one. One reason why we're so excited to host Professor Henderson for these virtual visits is the opportunity for us to put words into action in support of GISPIA and Pitt's efforts to become more inclusive and diverse institutions. Many of us have made statements in support of anti-racism recently, but hosting Dr. Henderson this semester allows us to continue to diversify the voices heard at the Ridgway Center and Ford Institute and GISPIA more broadly. Another reason why I'm so excited is on a more personal level. I was actually a student of Professor Henderson's when I was in the PhD program in political science at the University of Florida years ago, where he was a young assistant professor. I took 2 courses from him, and he was a model for me of somebody who combined top-notch teaching and research. He had a formative influence on me during my graduate school days. In hosting Professor Henderson today and later this semester, we hope that hosting Dr. Henderson will continue to think in active ways, promote inclusion, unity. Finally, I want to thank the following sponsors, without whose support Dr. Henderson's virtual visits would not be possible. These include the Ford Institute for Human Security, the Matthew B. Ridgway Center for International Security Studies, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at Pitt, and the University Center for International Studies, also here at the University of Pittsburgh. The way it's going to work is Dr. Henderson will open with his remarks, about 30 minutes or so, and then our 2 moderators, Taylor and Geraldine, will moderate questions both from themselves and from the audience. Of course, you didn't come here to listen to me, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Errol Henderson. Errol, please go ahead and unmute, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Professor Kinney. It's a pleasure to join you all, and a privilege actually to join you all. I want to thank the sponsors as well, GISPIA and the Ford Institute. It's really a privilege to be able to talk to you all about this important subject. So what I want to do now is I want to share my screen and begin a discussion with respect to today's focus. So let me just square myself away here. So you all should be able to see that screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so the topic, white supremacism in world politics, present at the creation, persistent to today. I was going to provide a nice anecdote if someone should ask me in the Q&A about the special relevance of the Ridgway Center. I have an anecdote that relates to the U.S. Army Infantry School and Airborne School in particular that relates to General Ridgway, if someone should ask. But I use it in my class to make the point about the importance of clarity. So that's one of the anecdotes, the many anecdotes I make. I share with students constantly that often I will use tangents to make points because you may be surprised by the appeal of certain points, myriad points to the very diverse students that we teach. I always remind them, there's a difference between being tangential and being irrelevant. A tangent is also a point on a line, you see. So we're going to talk about something today that's hardly tangential, it's central. White supremacism in world politics, present at the creation, persistent to today. So sometimes if people are wondering, I'd like to give a sort of smart aleck introduction to the importance of white supremacism in world politics. So it's a handy reference. So we'll start with something like this. You ask the question, is international war a major focus of international relations? And trained at the University of Michigan, we were taught the subject is world politics because we study more than the interaction of nations. There are non-state actors that are relevant to world politics, but especially in Europe, it's often referred to, and in Eastern schools referred to as international relations. I'll use them interchangeably here. So the abbreviation IR is for international relations and world politics. So is international war a major focus of IR? And of course, the answer is yes. Mhm. So ask yourself, what was the most destructive war in human history? The most destructive war in human history. And the answer there is, of course, World War II. And you ask, what individual, if there was one individual who was most responsible for World War II, that is making that conflict World War II, I think there's a clear answer. Adolf Hitler. Were Adolf Hitler's policies white supremacists? Well, clearly they were. So, white supremacism was a prominent factor in the most destructive international war in human history. The study of such wars being a major focus of IR, then clearly white supremacism is central to IR. That's the shorthand response to the relevance of white supremacism in IR. It's clear in the high politics of IR, which is the study of war, racism should be relevant there. It clearly is. Now, for something of greater depth, first let's define our terms. What do we mean by racism? It's simple. It's the belief in, practice, and policy of domination based on the specious concept of race. Why is race specious? Because there's no scientific basis for race. That is, we can see people who are different, but those differences are not discernible by race. Race doesn't have any biological basis. It has no anthropological basis. It's strictly a sociological construct or a social construct. We'll go back to that when we refer to Alain Locke. So racism is not simply bigotry or prejudice, but public policy and practice supported by institutional power, primarily state power. So racism is not simply bigotry or prejudice. There's a power dimension of racism. That's important. So white supremacism then is a form of racism, which presupposes the inherent superiority of people designated as white and justifies their denial of the human and civil rights of non-whites and the construction of systems, institutions, or relationships to perpetuate the superiority. One of the reasons I have the PowerPoints here and the definitions there, because I like to speak and catch my own rhythm. I encourage my students, don't try to chase me when I'm lecturing. Don't try to write down each thing I'm saying, but just get the notion. Part of it is being from Detroit, from Motown. We all think we got this rhythm and soul, or we all want to be singers in the first place. Not all. But white supremacism then is a particular type of racism. So that should be appreciated. So can anyone be racist? Let's dispose of some of these issues right away. Yes. Yes, it's a power relationship. So explain that. Racism describes a power relationship. In any situation in which power is relative, one can demonstrate racism. Therefore, anyone exercising greater relative power can be racist. For example, a professor in class. If I came to my class and I said, everyone who presents as white will earn a failing grade, that's racist. You see? Racist is relative whenever you have a relative power dimension. This is important to appreciate. So this is racism in the abstract. Can anyone be racist? Yes. But in practice, not. Racism in practice, we differentiate between functional forms of racism. See? There are functional or dominant forms of racism. That is the type of racism that predominates in a group, an institution, an organization, a state, a region, or the global system as a whole. There's one functional dominant form of racism in the United States and the global system as a whole. That's white supremacy. Let's go back to me in the class. If I said everyone who presents as white will earn a failing grade, that would make me racist. Now, if I actually did that at Penn State University, I wouldn't be there the next day. Is it? So can anyone be racist in the act? Sure. But in practice, there's one dominant form of racism in the USA. The functional form of racism is white supremacy. It prevails and predominates in the major life-giving and life-sustaining institutions of U.S. society. Nothing else comes close. And I put on the slides, medical apartheid, Harriet Washington. Look, if you look at racial disparities from the birth to the grave, white supremacism dominates. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Rothstein shows how racism is implicated in the practice of real estate institutions in the North. He's not talking about it in the South. To maintain Northern segregation, he makes an argument for reparations with respect to real estate and home ownership, and he's just focusing on the North, on the Color of Law. So that's why I give you these references. So I want to dispose of the notion that yes, anyone can be racist in practice, but in its functional form, the racism that controls the major life-giving and life-sustaining institutions in this country, we're talking about white supremacy. It's also the functional form of racism in the global system. They got that way through what we call racial imperialism. The prevailing expression of white supremacism is colorblind racism. I use an article by Bonilla, Silva, and Foreman in my class, my intro class. It's called "I'm Not a Racist, But," and it's a survey analysis of college students who present as white. And the common response, and what they demonstrate is the difference between Jim Crow racism and colorblind racism. So the common response is, should people have, should white folks have black friends? Well, let me change this. You always ask it in this order. Please list your 5 best friends, your 5 closest friends. Then you ask the question, okay? Should white folks have black friends and vice versa? And white respondents will typically answer the second question. Well, yes. Then the next follow-up question is, among those 5 friends you listed, how many were black? And the common response is, I'm not a racist, but okay, none of them. How many, do you have friends at work? Who are they? You ask them, and the response, there's a ready response because they're concerned with being viewed as someone who's a proponent of Jim Crow racism. But colorblind racism is manifest, but it only becomes obvious when you ask those follow-up questions as Bonilla, Silva, and Foreman do. So it's an excellent piece called "I'm Not a Racist, But." And throughout the presentation, I want to give you references. That's why I'm putting books up, so they'll be very visible. Institutions, we have institutions still experiencing historic firsts. Think of the practice in the academy, where my institution, Penn State University, has had 3% black faculty for 30 years. For 30 years, 3% black faculty. That's incredible consistency. 3% for 30 years. That's the kind of consistency you want from your football team. For 30 years? But there's a problem with consistency too. Let's keep the football reference too going. And for those in the UK, this is American football, so it doesn't work with the soccer reference. We have different analogies. It's like you have the running back who gets credit for being so consistent. The coach says, look, when you need 3 yards, he gets you 3 yards. He's consistent. That should be commended. The problem is, when you need 6 yards, he gets you 3 yards. You see? So consistency is not necessarily favorable when it's a negative thing. So this is what we have, this historic first. I'm the first tenured African-American in the political science department at Penn State University. Penn State University has never had a black full professor. Only last year did it tenure its first black woman in the political science department. I got here in 2002. I'm the first tenured black African-American professor in the history of Penn State. Look, I'm brilliant, but I'm not that damn brilliant. So the United States has had an African-American president before Penn State University has had an African-American full professor in political science. And it's not alone in that. Now think of the people who've habituated themselves to such environments. Predominantly white folks who've habituated themselves to this environment. They have not had African-American peers. So what do you think happens when they meet somebody like me? You see? Are they the best arbiters for determining the extent of white racism in their institutions or to evaluate its impact on others? They've normalized not having African-American peers in their department. So this is part of a challenge, and I come back to this when I talk about racism as a management problem, because that's what it is. Imagine if, and there was a time, imagine if all the professors are men, and they hired the first woman professor in the department, okay? The professors would realize that there was a management issue here, at minimum. That is, if you have your first woman hire in the department, there are certain structural changes that have to take place. The first one is, we got to get another bathroom in here. You see? What are the structural changes that need to take place when you hire your first African-American professor? I would argue that most professors, chairs, deans, have not even considered the issue. We talk about the evaluative criteria that we know is gendered. It's also race. It's also racialized. The evaluative criteria, but not just the standardized ones, the peer evaluations from professors who've habituated themselves to an environment where they have no African-American peers. We'll follow up with that. So let's go back. White supremacism of world politics, present at the creation. So I want to just be clear we're on the same sheet of music with respect to what racism is, okay? The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and America and the islands of the sea. That's famous from W.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. World politics has two academic birth mothers, the United States, the UK, and the US. One, the greatest colonizer, and the other, one of the worst enslavers. The white racism they practiced in their domestic politics, they cast abroad in their international politics. It's quite logical. It's actually it's a clear argument among liberal or idealist arguments in world politics that your domestic politics translates to your international politics. It underpins, for example, the democratic peace thesis. Okay? It followed that in the new academic field of international relations, Africans were viewed as subjects and unconscious participants in the march of history. That is, international relations was to be the study of the high politics of diplomats, jurists, and historians. This was no place for Negroes. That's actually from my first book that I published in 1995, Afrocentrism in World Politics. You've seen, Despia has shared my work, Hidden in Plain Sight, Racism and International Relations Theory. So I talk about on the theoretical level how racism informs world politics. And what it does is it creates a dualism, a subjective dualism related to the major paradigms of international relations, especially as they draw on notions of anarchy and the state of nature. I'm gonna leave that for you all and for your the IR students and scholars to engage that. If you'd like me to follow up, I will. But there's this subjective dualism that relates to theory, and an objective dualism that relates to racist practice. And what's important here is that many of the overwhelming number of states in the global system today were socialized, not through international anarchy, even to which it may have obtained, but through colonialism. Colonialism, and then they had the tragedy of being birthed. That is, they become independent in the only bipolar era in the history of the global system. The global system, not any regional bipolar structure, but the global system. And it was marked by the Cold War superpower rivalry. So this is what socialized most of the states in the global system. So this objective dualism is a result of chattel slavery, racial imperialism, sort of global Jim Crow. So in the 20th century, colonialism socialized the entities that would become post-colonial states into what? A global system in which they were politically marginal, economically dependent, and socially peripheral tributaries of their Euro-American metropoles, and later their patrons in the first bipolar global system in history, which became, or which was, and still is, I would argue, oligarchically ordered, oligopolist dominated white supremacist global order. So the major challenge to this global apartheid were, going back to the 19th century and the late 18th century, the slave revolutions epitomized in Haiti and the US. And I talk about the slave revolution in the US Civil War in the book, The Revolution in 1954. And the independence movements and revolutions in the colonial world epitomized in the places I mentioned there. The overwhelming majority of more than 200 states in this global system today emerged from those processes. So one would think that imperialism or decolonization would be a major foci of, the major paradigms of IR today. They're not. So Ken Walt engages Lenin's imperialism, for example, in his classic Theory of International Politics. And Alexander Neves, Nivi Manchanda, and Ravi Shilliam, who's doing a webinar right now, argued that closer to home may have been a more useful reference. Du Bois's The African Roots of War, which was published in 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly, and The Color of War, which repeats many of his arguments, or restates many of his arguments from his earlier work that was published in Foreign Affairs. These are not obscure outlets. Du Bois's argument was that national imperialism was fusing the mutual interests of bourgeoisie and proletariat in a racial imperialism targeting especially Africans and Asians, leading to disputes that generated World War I. So this is spelled out in The African Roots of War, and I'll leave it to you to read that. I won't read all of that, but I want you to see the quote where he's making this argument that both the white workers and the white capitalists, the white proletariat and the white bourgeoisie, are finding a mutual interest in the imperialism, a racist imperialism in the colony. And it's disputes related to those that's going to lead to the onset of World War II. What's key about this is not simply the argument, but this is an argument prior to Lenin's publication Imperialism. But this argument is rarely cited in international relations courses. It's rarely mentioned in text or edited volumes of readers on IR. I've shared these with IR scholars going back 20 years who publish readers, and they constantly promise to include it, but somehow they don't. So it's really the work of Robert Vitalis, his work on the Howard School of International Relations Theory. And he argues there that international relations emerges prior to World War I, mainly from the study of colonial administration. Okay? Said white supremacism was at the core of world politics. International relations was early understood as interracial relations. And the Howard School of IR theory was seminal to the discourse of international relations. That's Vitalis' argument. And I need to make a point. Vitalis makes this point as he's talking about IR theory, and that's the text. And I made an error in one of my publication in Millennium, where I said Vitalis dismissed as a diversion the relevance of the Howard School to IR theory. No, he was challenging those who would pose the question, or those who would attempt to dismiss as a diversion their relevance for IR theory. And he repeats that the Howard School did promulgate IR theory. So that was an error that I made. I want to make sure I correct that publicly each time I bring up Vitalis' excellent work. The architect of the Howard School was Elaine Locke, and the book you see is Jeffrey Stewart's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, over 900-page biography of Elaine Locke. His contributions are huge. They're as massive to international relations as they're ignored. Race, he's the first to argue that race is a social construct that I can find in English. He makes this point in 1915 as a challenge to Boas, and then a discussion with Callan. So he makes this point in 1915 that race is a social construct. He says white racist imperialism and racial imperialism is a key factor in major international war. And in the Great Disillusionment in September 1914, he's making the argument that what you have is a race war between two sides of the Germanic race, the Anglo-Saxons and the Teutons, for domination of the world racial empire. He's arguing that race is so fluid, it can be used against people who are heretofore viewed as racially similar, as well as folks who are racially different. He said the competing imperialism, Britain's imperialism, generated a counter imperialism, a counter movement for others who aspired to it. So Imperial Germany aspired to dominate the globe as Britain had. So you had this competition. It's interesting language that he used. If folks ask about it, I'll refer back to his article. But he saw this in September 1914, that this was a race war, that the racial imperialist chickens were coming home to roost. And Europeans were referring to each other the way they were referring to those in the colony. This foreshadowed also the coming racialization of the Nazis that would racialize as non-Aryans, heretofore some of the most assimilated Germans, and to use that as a justification for genocide. The Stalinist regime, though of course Stalin was Georgian, but the regime's Russian, Holodomor, the death by starvation against his fellow Slavic Ukrainians. And even to some extent, the Japanese genocide against the Chinese and the Koreans in World War II, that race could be used among those who were viewed as racially similar. But also racial imperialism generated counters to it in the form of the Pan movements, the Pan-Indian movement, Pan-African movements, especially. These are just some asides about Locke. He argues that races do not make civilizations. Civilizations created race. Race simply reflects your relationship to power. That's what he says. So these are some of the points that I made before. But he's the architect of Howard School. Who else is in the Howard School? Well, Ralph Bunche. These are not obscure people. He's the first African-American PhD in international relations, a Nobel laureate. His analysis of race and racism in IR 1936. I want to keep the original, you see the one in the middle, the original bronze booklet series, which was actually edited by Elaine Locke. That was 1936. And then he's one of the first, the Buell's study is more famous. His dissertation was a systematic analysis, empirical analysis of comparative colonialism, looking at the mandate system versus the colonial system. He's the architect of UN peacekeeping. If you're doing peacekeeping work, you're doing Ralph Bunche's work. How often does Ralph Bunche appear on your syllabi in your international relations class? Much less these. These are also the Howard School. They're not in the totality. Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, which examines the role of slavery in both the emergence of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. He goes on to become the first Prime Minister of independent Great Britain. Where does he appear on your syllabi? We know that to challenge racism in IR, the key, I don't like making war analogies, but the key front is the syllabus. It's the syllabus. And so it's so important that the syllabus reflects these important studies. Mers Tate, she's the first African-American woman Harvard PhD in international relations. Her book in 1942, The Disarmament Illusion, she's a disarmament specialist, is reviewed by Hans Morgenthau. Yeah, that Morgenthau. These are not obscure folks. And of course, Rayford Logan at the bottom, he conducted his analysis of the mandate system, which really goes back to his 1920s study, and helped as an organizer of the Pan-African Congress. There are many more in the Howard School. You know, John Hearns is at the Howard School. John Hearns conceives the security dilemma while he's a professor at Howard. that John Hearns. Roberta Wohlstetter is also at Howard. Here, one thrust of the Howard School is a focus on racial imperialism, and that's what I focused on thus far. It raises the issue of racial homelands, hostlands, and especially racial diasporas in world politics. I argue it suggests the paradigm of diasporism, and my present work focuses on that. And diasporism leads us to focus on the influence of governments and movements in IR, so state, non-state actors. Pan-Africanism is a particular movement to transform the global system of white supremacism. Why? It challenges the fundamental basis of white supremacism. It's the antipode of the polar opposite of white supremacism. So if you challenge, a Pan-Africanist challenge to white supremacism will disrupt the entire system, because the basis of white supremacism rests fundamentally on Black inferiority. It's a global application of Anna Julia Cooper's thesis of when and where I enter. And I want to make the point that folks are making arguments about these types of things, just not heavily in international relations or in political science in the academy. So I cite Carol Anderson to your right. That's her study, Eyes Off the Prize, about the human rights struggle. But going back to the left, you see where I say Rayford Logan mentored and Mers Tate inspired Joseph Harris. That's Professor Harris to the left. He was the architect of the Howard School of African Diaspora Studies, which, like the Howard School of IR, would become as significant as it is ignored. And that's the piece I wrote there. Both Mers Tate and Ralph Bunche, the first Black African-American PhDs in international relations, both of them come from Michigan, or they were raised in Michigan. Mers Tate in central western Michigan, and Bunche in Detroit. So no matter how hard I work, I won't even become the best IR scholar from Michigan. I won't be the best IR scholar in Detroit. Ralph Bunche has. But listen, let's talk about racism and mainstream IR theories. You talk about some obscure folks, or maybe we should know them, but a lot of them we don't. But take this quote: "The field of international politics has a surfeit of models, a lot of models and approaches that can be as easily applied to racial conflict as any other kind that mars the relations of nations." Who says that? That obscure IR scholar named James Rosenau. That's James Rosenau in 1970 in that edited volume, Race and Nations, A Conceptual Approach, which I have to the right. Look here, I will read some of this because this is important for emphasis. The first global attempt to speak of equality focused upon race. The first human rights provision of the United Nations Charter was placed there because of race. Look at the importance of race, what I've highlighted there. This is from Paul Gordon Lord in 1988. During the Cold War, the last line, racial discrimination and racism still represent the most serious problems for the world today. Yet, Roxanne Doty, IR scholar, published an article in Millennium, the journal from the London School of Economics, but still one of the best mainstream journals that deal regularly with these issues. Look at what she found when she looked for race in the IR journal. And this is part of the problem. The study of African-American perspectives in political science, my book, African Realism, and then the book to the right, look at what you see. This is a representation, the book to the right, that's what you find on Africa. Look at my book, IR theory, and the consummate, what do you say, the model for IR theory is what? Is the chess pieces. And then this, and this is what I'll close with, this is where I'm from. Upper left-hand corner, that's the Brewster Project, Detroit. That's the dedication in 1935. I see the time, I got 1:30 left. I see you, Taylor. So the, Eleanor Roosevelt is dedicating the groundbreaking in 1935. Look down to the bottom. That's the Frederick Douglass component of what becomes the Brewster Douglass Housing Project. That's where I'm from. I was born there. I wasn't born in the hospital. I was born there. And then the upper right-hand corner, that's the Brewster Center, the Wheeler Center. That's where Joe Louis trained. It was so iconic, and it's the only part of the projects that's still there. It was so iconic that when Ali came to fight his last fight against Holmes, he trained there. And those three ladies that you may see who are also from the Brewster Projects. One of them lived right across the street from me. That's Florence Ballard to the left, Mary Wilson to the right. The middle one, her name was Diane, but she liked Diana better. That's Diana Ross, who lived across the street. And these are my publications here. I'm going to stop there so we can have questions. I show you the Brewster Projects to show that's where I'm come from. I'm not special in that regard, but when we talk about tapping the diverse communities that can become our professors, they're professors that come from the Brewster Projects. And if you haven't met one, you met one now. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Henderson, for a fascinating introduction for many of us, an introduction to an important set of problems and conundrums. Not an introduction for others in the audience, I'm sure, who have thought more deeply about this than several of us. I have to admit that I have not thought enough about it. We're going to now move to a question and answer period. I'm going to let my colleague Geraldine Pacheco ask the first question. Geraldine?
Thank you so much, Dr. Siebel. And Dr. Henderson, thank you again so much for coming here today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. My first question is just how to be an anti-racist. So I come from the Latinx community. There's a lot of racism and colorism. That's a big problem in the community. So how would you say one could approach it to family members or friends in the community, in any community really? How could you approach that, and how can you solve or start solving this problem?
I appreciate the question. As you probably see, I don't do much, or in my classes, I don't do anti-racism. I don't know what I am. I talk about empirical evidence to support the claims that we make in world politics. The problem with white supremacism, beyond it just being odious, the problem is it's not accurate. You see, if you're going to teach scholarship, it should be accurate. You see. So what I teach may sound to some like advocacy. I don't do advocacy. You shouldn't be at the, you don't enroll in classes to articulate the professor's views. When I teach Marxism, I sound like a Marxist. I teach feminism, I sound like a feminist. I teach realism, I sound like a realist. And when I teach liberalism, so for me, it's accurate analysis. And folks say, well, people come with all types of opinions. Sure. Well, you're in America. You got a right to your opinion. However, in an academic environment, we privilege an informed opinion. You see? So I'm not trying to have some special discourse. I don't turn the chairs into a circle and make it mystical. I don't exoticize this stuff. You're going to find this on my syllabus, what I talked about today. The way I talk now is how I talk in my classes. I encourage students to make complaints. It's their right to complain. I only challenge the receptivity of administrators to certain types of complaints as opposed to others. So complaints about me, or the fact that Dr. Henderson, you're the one that makes it racist because you raised race. It's ridiculous. I'm not wasting my time with such things. How do you confront it? By confronting it. Let me give you an example. I was walking across I won't say his name. I don't think he has a problem with it, but I won't say his name. I was walking across the campus with a professor. This is a professor. Let me tell you ahead of time. We together, we would ultimately work to get a almost $2 million grant to develop a data set. And a lot of my work is database. A data set to create this book, the last book I showed you, on religion and world politics. But we're just meeting. We're walking across the campus. He presents his wife, and we're going to lunch. He says, well, Errol, how do you like it here at Penn State? I said, I like it a lot, except for the white supremacism. He said, oh, well, you probably know more about that than I would. I said, no, I think you would. He said, why you say that? I said, because most of the white supremacism I deal with come from white folks, like you. They look just like you. And he gave the best response that a white person could give to that. He said, that's a good point. And we went and had lunch. See, that's my small talk about white people. Folks get used to accommodating not the interest of white folks, but the interest of white racists. Now, if he would have started talking to me about, but most of the white supremacists I deal with the same thing you deal with, except I confront it. You probably tolerate it. You accept that, well, they're my friends, and now friend doesn't supersede what I'm dealing with. You read the op-ed that I wrote over a year and a half ago, Being Black at Penn State. And I stand by everything I wrote there. The student newspaper investigated it, and then they published it. And I hope other people will replicate that. Being Black at Pitt, Being Black at I got it from Michigan. The students at Michigan, Being Black at University of Michigan. I say, demystify this stuff. That's why the first example I was going to give was one on clarity. I don't engage, you confront it by confronting it. And don't take it home to your children. Don't go and kick your dog. Don't kick dogs. Don't take it out on somebody else. Confront the racists that are in front of you. You see what I'm saying? So for me, it's a simple task of how you engage it. And I would do the same as in whatever community that I find myself in. I hope that answered your question.
So, thank you. And Jolene and I are going to alternate back and forth asking questions from the audience. I'm going to pick up on your talk just now about recognizing and confronting racism by combining a question from Nate Ekstrom and from Mary Grace. First is, if someone was Asian and was in a math class and the professor asks that student to teach the class, would you consider that racist? And the second question is, this is from Mary Grace, when I hear, quote, I am not racist, but, close quote, we know bad stuff is coming. What are some other clues to listen for?
Again, appreciate the question. Again, I like to demystify these things, and I hope you can see, the reason I use the example, I said for 30 years, Penn State has had 3% African-American faculty. Racism as it's represented in institutions, the racial disparities in healthcare that scholars like Tom Levis at Tulane write about. Those are the things that become much more salient to me than these personal interactions with racists. I explained what racism was. Racism, the belief in, practice, and the policy of domination based on the specious concept of race. Racism is not the same as prejudice or bigotry. There's a power dimension of racism. So I don't know why somebody is asking any student to come up and teach. I tell you one thing, if the professor asks you to come up and teach, you should ask for part of their salary, okay? I don't do that. I don't do group projects because I'm too lazy to write a lecture. I don't do that. You don't get a group grade. I challenge white supremacism, including in the pedagogy. My students write 2 to 3 page essays every week to develop their analytical skills. Students ask me, so Dr. Henderson, can I ask you a personal question? No, we don't have a personal relationship. We have a professional relationship. But you may be surprised at how wide professionalism, how much that encompasses. So I spend a lot of time on professional development. So I don't know what these professors' motives are or why they ask, and I don't get caught up in whether I think this thing is racist or not. I gave you a definition for racism. Take it upon yourself to apply it in the situations where it merits. Now, let me qualify. If I was teaching K through 12, I'd have a different answer. I teach adults. these students who can be called out to the military. I was in the U.S. Army at 17 years old, because I didn't have a choice of the limited options I had available to myself at the time. Okay, but I don't infantilize students. So I got no life lessons for you. I can talk professional development. I can talk about navigating your matriculation. But they already have parents or guardians, so I don't do that. But if I was in K through 12, I'd have a different answer. I'm teaching adults, so I don't have any suggest to you beyond going to the counseling office. But let me make this clear: the people who get the worst academic advising are Black folks, and the folks who get the worst of the worst are Black women. And we have data to support this. I want to be clear about this. I rarely say things, unless I'm talking about my gorgeous flowing hair, I rarely say things for which I don't have empirical evidence to support. These things are not obscure. We don't need to mystify them further, okay? So I hope we can focus on more substantive things about the material that we've discussed, for which I have some expertise in.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. I will go with the next question from Nancy. It says, any thoughts on how to incorporate this knowledge into education, media, public discourse, common knowledge, so that it doesn't have to be rediscovered and relearned each generation? White supremacists control all the information sources and successfully perpetuate it through generations.
Okay, one thing I share with my students, I'm absolutely opposed to absolutes and dogmatically against dogma. So I don't do the all and the white supremacists don't control everything. Okay, so stop. You're doing it now. And that's why I give so much credit to what you all are doing at Pittsburgh. This is phenomenal what you're doing. There's no half-stepping. You're going straight to these issues, and it's one of the things I share with students here. Some of the students who are protesting here, give them some historical context. And it's I say in 1964, members of the Civil Rights Movement invited whites to come to the South for strategic reasons and others. That became Freedom Summer. I turned to the white students who are protesting and the community folks. I said, nobody invited you. You came on your own volition. I think that's what makes this special and different, okay? So I want to keep putting things in context. So, to your question, these two books, Revolution Will Not Be Theorized and Scripture, Shrine, Scapegoats, and World Politics. My last two books, published 7 months apart. They're both free. They're free online. How do we disseminate? I make both of those books free. You can get them online through the Tome Initiative. The Tome Initiative through University Press. One of them was published by SUNY State University of New York Press. The other by the University of Michigan Press. So you can access this in high schools. You can use this in from across the gamut. Of course, students, you can use this in your courses. You can use these in prisons. You can use these in youth facilities. Wherever you can access them online. So my books are free. I sometimes shied some of my friends who make class analysis. I said, you make a class analysis, but you haven't found a way to make your book free. I started college walking from the Brewster Projects to Wayne State University. Been sometimes harassed by police who wouldn't believe that there were books in my book bag. I was often stopped. That's what was in my book bag, was books. Well, of course, walking from the Brewster Projects, you got a big bag, a book bag. There can't be books in there. So this is how we access it. How do you access what we're doing now? Put it on your syllabus. Put Henderson on your syllabus. Put the other people that are cited in these books on your syllabus. Again, one of the reasons why I shared the PowerPoint and I made it that way, so you can see those nice pictures, those books. And these people are not obscure if you're in IR, especially when I put probably the most surprising things for many people who are IR scholars and when they saw James Rosenau. You should look at what Carl Deutsch is saying in this same volume. That same Carl Deutsch on international communities and the nerves of government. That Carl Deutsch, okay? The way to do it is to demystify this. I'm really, and I don't ghettoize my work. Look here, I teach international relations. I support Black studies, Africana studies. I'm an international relations scholar. That's what I teach. I teach political science. This is how I taught in my intro to political science course, 300 folks. It's on the syllabus. Du Bois is on the syllabus, okay? White supremacism is on the PowerPoint. It's gonna be on your test, okay? Bell hooks is on the syllabus. This is what you're gonna find. You're going to learn about Anna Julia Cooper. You're also going to learn from Christine Sylvester, Cynthia Int'l, Roxanne Doty, of course, Robbie Shilliam. You're going to learn because they're on the syllabus. And that's why it's so important. How many of you have colleagues, you know, not only just have the same syllabus in IR for 30 years, but they're no Black scholars. And I'm not saying you just put a Black scholar for relevance. How are you talking about disarmament if Hans Morgenthau can find merit in Merz Tate's piece on disarmament? How come you don't even know her and you're teaching disarmament? You see? So I hope that got to your question.
Thank you. The next question is also on scholarship and the practice of scholarship from AJ Parasram. And AJ asks, do you think it would be reasonable for us, while doing peer reviews in IR articles, to ask scholars to address the normalized structural white supremacy in the IR system? Because there is an alarming amount of published work that sidesteps this by just saying, not what I'm talking about. But as you rightly show, it's impossible not to.
Okay, again, reference to absolutely opposed to absolutes, dogmatic against dogmatic. It's not impossible to, okay? But just qualifying that one point. But yeah, that's part of it, to make this part of peer review. And that's why this is so important, to do this on several fronts. And the classroom is sort of the final frontier, if you will. But for some, it's the first, because it's the easiest and it can be ignored. You have your one scholar or your resident person who does the quote diversity work. But as a peer reviewer, I often do this. I often cite these scholars. It was Ronald Walter, the brilliant IR scholar at Howard, who called it footnote apartheid, where you had to cite the mainstream scholars, and if you cited other ones, they were not treated as one. They're not part of the canon, but not even that. They're often treated as not relevant. I call it bibliocide. So in this book, which really focuses on the Black Power movement in the U.S., where the only numbers are page numbers, most of my reference are to African-American scholarship and activists. In this book, which is heavily quantitative, I still bring in where they're applicable to the argument, African-American, African scholars in particular. Not exclusively so, but I want to make a point about them in particular. And again, I focus on I focus on African and Black as in the challenge to white supremacism. It's not a singular focus, but it's a particular one. And that's why in the book, African Realism, this is what makes this one so important. This book is utterly neglected. It wasn't even reviewed by the major Perspectives in Politics. Actually didn't review it. It won a Choice Outstanding Academic title. But what I deigned to do here was to draw IR theory from African political processes. There's over 50 countries in Africa. So you can do the foreign policy of Britain and France and you're doing IR. You study the foreign policies of 50 African countries, it's comparative politics. So this one was ignored because I deigned to draw international relations theory, and I do, from Africa's international relations. There are conceptual chapters, including a chapter that focuses on and expands hidden in plain sight, focuses on white supremacism and IR theory. Then there are 3 quantitative chapters. So what happened? Most people who do quantitative work are not doing race or racism, or don't address it. And most folks doing racism and IR don't do quantitative work. So I made no friends here with this book. But this is part of it. It's challenging it and having an atmosphere that's conducive to that intellectual development. But so much of it is not. So what do? We draw on examples. That's why I brought up being Black at Penn State. You'll see that long train of things that I cite, that I challenge, and I struggle with at Penn State. But I still show you my publications. We published those 2 books in a 7-month period. I talked to you about me and my white colleague going across, but we got a $2 million grant. Now, I didn't get all that money. I don't have $2 million over here, y'all. But you were still produced. Well, I teach people to be methodologically plural. I have little patience for folks that's sort of like one-trick pony. They're a post-structuralist, a post-modernist, post-toasties. I can't keep up with it. But I'm doing empirical work. Why? Because I want to change empirical reality to make meaningful policy recommendations. Study quantitative analysis, study languages, study history, study the many methods that have been used so you can make policy. But when I say policy, I don't simply mean policy at the level of diplomats. I mean grassroots policy as well. I call activism policy work, okay? So, and some of us were activists. Well, I was a student activist. Before that, I was an activist in our community with wonderful people like Clementine Barfield in Detroit and Teferi Brent, who's still in Detroit, who's doing wonderful work, mostly around the killing of Black children. This was the urban peace and justice movement in the late 80s, early 90s. So why do I say that? I say that to show you don't have to accept to be a scholar or an activist. No, there's wonderful traditions, including the one of the Howard School, where we're both, okay? You don't have to be Black to adopt that, but just to recognize that that is also a tradition in our academic field and to encourage folks along that path. I've encouraged folks here at Penn State to do policy work, even when we weren't doing policy work, and one of them went off to be a policy advisor during the Obama administration and was working at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I have folks that I've worked with across the political gamut. I don't require a certain political orientation. I don't even know your political orientation. I want you to be able to master the subjects under study in our academic field, and I evaluate you on that. Okay, so I'm really big on that. It may sound like what I'm doing is advocacy. In the classroom, I'm about teaching students to become excellent analysts of political phenomena. And that's how I was taught from folks like David Singer, Ali Mazrui at the University of Michigan, Ken Organsky, Walter Mebane, Haynes Walton, Harold Cruz. There's such a range of them that taught us at the University of Michigan, and then before that. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. Next question. In Hidden in Plain Sight, you write grippingly about the norm against noticing racism in IR theory and the discipline. Can you talk more about the norm against noticing racism and sociology of the academic discipline?
I think when we talk about the norm against noticing racism in the sociology of the discipline, did I get that right? Or and the sociology.
Norm against noticing racism and sociology of the academic discipline.
Oh, I got you. Oh, it started. I mean, some of you're experiencing this now as grad students or even as undergrad. We don't do that. Okay, you're doing race. Okay, what are we really talking about here? Because racism, a lot of these issues are economic. Okay, a lot. Your concept is something else. See, so reject. It can be both and. Okay, and so you don't have to argue so much about it. Yeah, okay, it's economic too, and it's racist. Okay. So it's a similar argument when especially so let me stay on point. So you have this norm against noticing, and that's why it's so important that you do excellent work in the subject matter that's of interest to you. I have my first book. It's called Afrocentrism and World Politics. It came out of my dissertation. Only numbers in it are page numbers. I promised David Singer, who was my advisor on my dissertation, that I would do quantitative analysis of culture and world politics. But when I came to the subject, I thought I would be testing Afrocentric theses in world politics from the Afrocentric theoretical arguments. But I didn't find compelling Afrocentric theoretical arguments. So the book is largely critical of that. And so I had to write the book that proposed Afrocentric theory or an Afrocentric paradigm. And that's what brought me originally to the focus on diasporas in 1995. The advisor to this project is David Singer. David Singer does not have a history of work on Afrocentrism, but he had enough faith that I was going to do this work and do it well. And he told me, he said, yeah, I don't know about, he said, but I can follow a logical argument. So he encouraged it, see? Even though he wasn't a proponent of it, and again, you don't have to be an advocate of it, but I'm saying this wasn't his focus. So I was persistent in saying this is what I want to work on and making arguments to those who disagree with me. That's what I encourage folks. You create these, people create these, and institutions will encourage these echo chambers. Singer always constantly taught me, I was not a Singer student. He wouldn't accept that. You don't become siloed to a professor. And you don't become siloed to a particular approach. Be eclectic, methodologically plural. but be willing to make your arguments to those who disagree with you. Now listen to me now. I'm not talking about making arguments to white supremacy. I'm not sitting down justifying my humanity to anyone, okay? But I'm talking about people who are serious about the subject, sure. The problem with white supremacy, it's a lie, it's untrue. So why am I mean, it's where I have the Santa Claus theory of world politics. I'm not wasting my time with that. However, there are inquiries that are meaningful and are challenging across the spectrum. So I strongly encourage you to keep noticing and keep putting it forward. And even when you send it out, you send it out for review. Say, I'd like to have this review, and I hope I can have someone like Professor Henderson or Robbie Chilliam or Amir Sabaratna. I want someone like that to review my piece, okay? So you keep noticing it, and I just encourage you to press upon it in your classroom as well. Well, I heard Dr. Henderson said, I heard you talking about World War I, Professor, but you don't engage Du Bois's thesis on World War I. Could you say something about that? Well, I don't know about that. I'm giving you a bad answer, okay? Well, I don't know about that. Well, you think you should? Can we have someone, or can you review it so we can have this discussion in our class? Because students will motivate this change often more than professors will. Because students are, unfortunately, you're the consumers of the product we create, and some of this is market driven. And if you begin to demand these things, and what are these things? It's a better education because it's more accurate. Look at what Du Bois sees. How does Alain Locke see this in September of 1914? It's not even the World War yet, but he sees this. He sees this in September 1914. Well, he's the first African-American Rhodes Scholar too, and he is brilliant, okay? Notice also that when I talk about these folks' arguments, I'm not talking biography. I'm not talking about their life. I'm not trying to go home with these people. I'm just talking about their theoretical argument. I'm not looking to join a cult or to follow that. No, and you shouldn't feel obligated to that. People study Althusser. A Marxist study Althusser. Althusser killed his wife. They literally, he killed his wife. They study Althusser. Don't get caught up in you become an advocate of this person because, no, just take their theoretical argument and apply it and be able to make a compelling argument about why you think that is relevant to your particular puzzle or question that you want to engage. But I'm a big proponent of empirical evidence. I have little patience with abstractions for abstraction's sake. That's not my penchant. Empirical arguments to change empirical reality in ways that comport with human liberation.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm going to combine two questions, which I've done before. We have 48 questions that have been asked, and we don't have that much time. We have until 1:30, so we have 25 minutes still, but I do want to give as many people a chance to air their questions as possible. So this first one is from Anna Agatha Angelou. Agatha Angelou, who says, "Hello, Errol. This is Agatha Angelou. Thanks for this excellent presentation. I really appreciate your insistence about white supremacy and the connections to the grand thinkers of IR who have been relegated to the margins of or to other fields. I would like to hear a bit more about your thoughts that were whether a focus on race as opposed to colonial and focus on race as opposed to the colonial and enslavement and patriarchy forecloses the way IR grapples with race theory today." So let me read that again. I would like to hear a bit more about your thoughts on whether a focus on race as opposed to a focus on colonial and enslavement and patriarchy forecloses the way IR grapples with race today. And
I appreciate that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me concatenate another question to that. Can you talk about, this is from Michael Goodhart, can you talk about what would be the implications for the field of IR if it were to address its racist constructions and engage with the work of the Howard School, with Du Bois' work on transnationalism, et cetera? What are some of the key debates or concepts that this field would be forced to evaluate and reevaluate?
Take the last one first, it would be a lot better, but I'm gonna come back to that. But Agatha Angelo, this is a scholar who's a piece on the House of IR. Should be read by those who are interested in this subject as well. Let me address her point, and thank you so much for tuning in here. One, I want to make the point. I don't do race, okay? I talk about racism and white supremacism. See? So once you do that and your focus is on white supremacism, well, how did it get this way? So it compels you to focus on racism, chattel slavery, colonialism, imperialism. It forces you to do that, you see? It's going to implicate, clearly, patriarchy. It's going to implicate so many dimensions of the oppression that white supremacism is, I often say, I focus on political, economic, and social, arbitrary modes of political, economic, and social domination. A political system in world politics is largely oligarchic. The economic system is oligopolist. And the social systems are white supremacist and patriarchal. You could expand them to heterosexist and ableist as well. But I said these capture the greatest swaths of the arbitrary domination of humanity. I focus on this one, white supremacism, and I hope folks can see the universalism. I say take whatever category you have that's of oppressed people, women, poor, gay, trans, disabled, make them black, and you'll have the worst of those categories, So I focus on that. The universalism is in that, not in some pretend cosmopolitanism of Kant. Kant's cosmopolitanism is inherently white supremacist as well. Now I want to be clear, and this is going to, it takes a close reading. White supremacist analysis can be accurate in describing, can successfully describe and predict phenomena in world politics. That's part of being in a white supremacist reality. You see? That's not a white supremacist statement. For example, prior to 2008, if you said the presidents of the United States were all white, but that's accurate. That's not a racist statement. That's a reflection of a racist reality. You say to today, all the presidents of the United States were men. It's not a sexist statement. It's a recognition of a sexist reality. White supremacist arguments, to the extent that leaders have followed from arguments of white supremacist policymakers, then the policies themselves would be white supremacist. There's a reason why Carol Anderson books focus on the Double V campaign in World War II, African Americans fighting for victory abroad and victory at home, to overthrow the white supremacists abroad and to overthrow those who are at home. See, it's important to appreciate. But what white supremacists can't do is the difficult work for us. It can explain phenomena. It can describe it. It can predict it. But it does a poor job of explaining. Why? Because it's not true. It's a lie. It's inaccurate, okay? So I talk about white supremacism, so I never take my focus off. I'm not talking about race. I just disposed of the issue of race with Locke. But notice this. Locke doesn't jettison the concept. He says race is a useful concept to organize what? Resistance to white supremacism. Remember, he's the architect of the New Negro, the Harlem Renaissance in 1925. So he doesn't jettison the concept of race. That is, race means something in society. It just has no scientific basis, okay? Just as gender has no scientific basis, but it means something in society, you see? So I want to be clear. That's what I mean when I say I don't do race. That's my shorthand for saying I want to focus on racism, white supremacism, because there you can't dislodge that from the power relation and the oppressive institutions, practices, and structures that are associated with it. So that's why I don't, conflate the two. So I don't deal with what appears as a dilemma for Agatha Angelo. It's not. I do racism, imperialism, chattel slavery, and what that pertains. Portends, I'm sorry. To the second, the second question I'm losing it now. The second question asked me about Or what would it do to the field? What would it suggest to the field? What would they? Go ahead, Taylor.
So it's, I'm just scrolling back to look for it so I can read it exactly. But basically, he's asking if your critique were taken seriously by IR scholars, how would it change what the field studies?
I got you. Okay, I remember now. Well, first of all, it is taken serious. It's just taken serious by too few. I commend to you Int'l Oren's Our Enemies and Us. And he talks about the relationship between IR scholars and foreign policymakers in the U.S. especially. Int'l Oren, he's at the University of Florida, excellent book called Our Enemies and Us. He says some things that are really discomforting to many IR folks. He got into a back and forth with Gabriel Allman as well, I remember, that's published. But he makes comments that are historically supported, that are for some unfortunate, and for me, and I think for him as well, I don't speak for him, they're quite revealing. For example, the APSR wrote a not unflattering critique of Mein Kampf. You see what I'm saying? Ralph Bunche, I don't think was ever, or Du Bois was never published in the APSR, you know. For Foreign Affairs, as Vitalis has documented, its original, the original name of the journal, it became the House organ of the Council of Foreign Relations in 1922. From 1919 to 1922, it had its previous title, the Journal of International Affairs, if I remember correctly, Journal of International Relations. But from 1910 to 1990, it had its foundational title, the Journal of Race Development. These folks knew what they were writing about. They were quite forthcoming. They were white supremacists, the founders of the field. They celebrated it often. They talked about it quite openly. So one, it would disabuse us of the notion that we have been talking about similar things throughout. Now, they say, well, Dr. Henderson, so then if you implicate Immanuel Kant's racism, then to do the democratic peace, does that ipso facto make one racist? No, that's silly. Okay, you can argue for your own reasons that democracies are less likely to fight each other. That's, there's nothing racist about that. But if you then argue, that's not racist, but that's also not Kant's argument. Kant's argument suggests or strongly asserts that Blacks do not have the intellectual acumen, the intellectual wherewithal to perform functions of government. Therefore, they cannot effectuate a democratic peace. So if you argue that democracies don't fight each other, that's fine. That's a democratic peace argument. That's not a Kantian argument. But in 1993, Bruce Russet argues that the democratic peace approximates what captures, and I don't know if he used the word epitomizes. Please go back to my reference. I don't want to misquote him. But he says it reflects Kant's argument, but that's not accurate. Kant's argument is a white supremacist argument. So what we'd be forced to do is to deal with the actual origins of the field, almost like dealing with reality, you know? What a burden. Okay? So I don't take these things that they're not difficult, they're not challenging. People do it on their own inertia. They do it because they're used to it, and they do it mainly because they profit from it. I talk about the things where non-whites may suffer under white supremacism. We also need to talk about where whites profit from it. There's a reason why if Penn State in particular has never tenured a Black African-American full professor in political science, who have they tenured, you see? Or who have they promoted to a full professor is the question that should be asked. You see, what works have gone unpublished that we now have to find these excellent works in edited volumes because they couldn't get published in the mainstream volume for so many years. It's almost like the equivalent, I don't like doing this, but I do this, hopefully it's successful, is the academic equivalent of all those of asterisks that should go in the records of for baseball that doesn't include Satchel Paige at his prime or Josh Gibson or many of those who were not allowed to come into white-dominated Major League Baseball. And the question should be, how should the asterisk be applied to all of those who did that or who participated in that? And I get each year, I just get so, it bothers me when I hear another story about Jackie Robinson and how the self-control he exhibited by not responding to the racist ball players. Why don't they have a list of all the white racist ball players? Okay, talk about, put that list out there. This is why I say it's not just when you don't have Black professors. How many professors, white professors, have been there 10, 20, 30 years who've habituated themselves to this? They maintain the status quo. I was having this argument in the law school where someone says, well, one of the reasons that you have racism perpetuated many of these academies is because it's just ignorance. I say, look here, this is not to disparage. I hope this is just to make a simple point about income, okay? I made this point. I said, look here, the custodians aren't making these policies on hiring and firing. The people making hire and fire decisions in academia mostly have PhDs. They're not ignorant. I don't use these euphemisms. Like when I talk about white supremacism, I don't talk about racial threat. White folks, they're afraid. White folks not afraid. We had an incident on campus. The white students were screaming at members of organizations, black student organization here, and they said this was about a decade ago, and the leaders said that if I'm call the police on you because you keep using these racial slurs. They were calling them the racial slur that rhymes with triggers. And the white students from above, they said, call the police. They're not going to do anything except arrest you. And both the black students and the white students knew they were right. The first police killing in State College, the first discharge of a police weapon against a human that kills a human, in this environment, there's so few black people, somehow involved a black person whose father had called for a mental health check. That's Osage. He was killed in his own home on a mental health check. How do you do that? What's the probability that the first use of police killing in State College is of a black person? The first use of a police taser was against a black woman. That's why this excellent coalition here, the 320 Coalition, is involved in protests for justice for Osage. So what will it change? It will make this field more accurate, and it's not simply being reflective, but simply accurate, you see? So that we can do the type of analysis that does what? Has an actual impact on the life chances of the peoples whose policies we affect. Because that's what we should be talking about or focused on. Not simply states, but the people who are inside them. That's why the Ford Institute is so important. Part of one of our chapters in our book looks at religion and human security. Why the issues of human security are so important. I actually had a Ford fellowship at the University of Michigan, a pre-doctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan. So I have affinities with Ford, especially Henry Ford II, the grandson in Detroit as well. But nevertheless, so the field would be moved forward, and I think in more meaningful ways to deal with prevalent issues in world politics. And many of those issues relate to white supremacy. You may see something else, and I hope I don't appear marginal. When I talk about white supremacy, the way I focus on white supremacy, I hope others will focus more on patriarchy. They will focus more on sexuality. I just don't assume that they all go together. So I don't want to appear to be marginalizing. It's out of appreciation of what they are. You see? Just like I don't believe that all oppressed people go together. No, the experiences of African Americans are not even the same as the experience of Native Americans, much less the same of black, white, red, and brown Latino Americans or Latinx. Which ones? You see? Or of white Americans, disaggregated this German Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans. I think it's important that we do that. Because what is, as one scholar said, what is humanity except a construct for the convenience of conversation, unless it consists of the many diverse peoples that comprise it? I don't do the lumping together, even though I am lumping some to talk about African Americans, but that's the biggest lump I'm willing to make at this point. and mainly to challenge white supremacism in doing that. And if I can make, no, I'll stop there because I won't be conscious of time.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. And I definitely agree with that last point you said about not all oppressed people go together. That was a great point. Thank you. I have a question here. Policymakers and diplomats in both the US and UK are mainly white, but both countries are increasingly diverse. I understand that there should be room for anyone to study world politics if that's their interest. But isn't the problem rooted in who's in the position of power making decisions with implications on minorities? I'm going to do what Dr. Siebel did and combine another question because I feel like they kind of go together. The second question is, what effect, if any, does the rise of non-white powers, and the example they give was China, have on white supremacism and world politics?
Let me start with the second one first. Often the arguments with respect to the second one don't appreciate what imperialism was and is, or what neocolonialism is. You don't have to be white to be white supremacists, and all white folks are white supremacists. And also the countries themselves can aspire. That's why I use those examples about, and this is the beauty of Locke's insight. A race can be used with respect to people who appear similar or different. Bell Hooks makes the point in Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, another reference I use in my Intro to World Politics class. She argues that it's important to move, and when she says move, she doesn't mean like get over it. No, she means engage thoroughly, but keep struggling to different planes. From victimization to representation to agency. So it's important that we're talking about agency. Representation is important. All three of those are important. Right? I want to be clear. But representation arguments often just ignore, again, it's the empirical reality. Whites in South Africa never comprised more than 15% of the population. They dominate the country for over a century. Numbers are not power. What's power? Power is power. That's it. Knowledge is power. No. Power is power. I like clarity. So you're going to get the airborne school story. I'm trying not to do it. But it's, so we want to demystify these things. So you don't have to be a member of those communities to articulate those interests, okay? I don't have to bring up examples of either Viola Uzo in the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, or Ruth First in South Africa, or Marilyn Buck in the United States, the revolutionary. It's not a requirement, and that's why it's so important to demystify it. Also, there's a real difference, just thinking about movements today, there's a real difference from the Attorney General in Kentucky, who's Black, and the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, in Minnesota, who's also Black. But there's a huge difference in their policy orientation. So it doesn't necessarily follow that the assumption of people, I don't like this term, of color, non-white folk, to formerly white clubs. What's the example of Japan in the interwar period? When the U.S. under Woodrow Wilson orchestrates the rejection of the Japanese proposal for a clause that includes racial equality in the League of Nations Covenant, the Japanese leadership, now we have to be clear, this was Taisho Japan. Those that would commit the atrocities were Showa Japan. So, but upon assumption of power that mirrored many whites, in Imperial Japan, you have the rape of Nanking. You have the prosecution of war and genocide against Chinese by the Japanese militarists. I want to be clear. It's the Japanese militarists in the Showa regime, but also against the Korean. The phenomena of another one of these awful euphemisms, the Korean comfort women. These things are raped and sex trafficking and sometimes murdered women. So it doesn't necessarily follow that the assumption of power. Now, where does it follow? If you look at the Pan-Indian movement and the Pan-Africanist movement, here you have movement to transform the global system, not simply to get ascendancy in it, but to transform it. But clearly, by the time of Mao's rapprochement with Nixon, whatever revolutionary transformation that China was going to make, good or bad, was probably going to parrot what the other major powers were doing with respect to their foreign policies. This is by the early 70s, okay? So it doesn't necessarily follow that the assumption to the club will do that. Nevertheless, there are some excellent examples where you have these independent paths that are pursued by those who are non-white members of the most powerful club in the world. And this is part of the challenge of changing the UN Security Council as well. But this was part of the concern. When I put up Anderson's book, when you look at an appeal to the world that Du Bois helped pen in order to have the United Nations investigate the human rights abuses, the crimes against African Americans in to have the United Nations do that. But the main person who rejected that, the main instrument, not the main person, there's a lot of others, but the key one was Eleanor Roosevelt. Okay? So it's important that we see opportunities and challenges, but we don't simply follow the skin color of those who articulate. It's just like in some ways like me when I'm abroad. I say, well, this is very much an American point of view. Yeah, but I don't know how many Americans sound like me, American IR scholars. It's not simply having a different background, it's having a different focus and a different interest. But again, coming from studying these phenomena, but studying them toward an objective of human liberation that I think many people are concerned about and many people construct differently. But in challenging white supremacism, that's why I do my best to be straightforward. You don't hear anecdotes that are dispositive. I may share an anecdote with you, but not like it's evidence. The evidence I provide are the empirical studies that I refer to that I've conducted myself or that other scholars have. So I want to make clear, I don't have this insight because I happen to have this exquisite tan. That's not where the insight comes from. It comes from serious scholarship, and I hope folks recognize that. So the implication of some of these, and I don't do predicting and forecasting. I don't do that. And I don't claim much more than I can demonstrate, I hope. But so I don't do what this foretells. I said, we can change these things now. You're in the presence of this change. You're what this change looks like. You may never invite me back, but today, this is what it looks like. And to study with the people from who are on this, who help organize this, this is so important. And to replicate it and to keep replicating it. You're the change that you've been waiting for.
Okay, thank you very much. We have just 2 minutes left, and I want to ask one final question from Zach Karaja, who was a student of mine at GISPIA and is now teaching as a junior faculty member. And then I'll turn it over to Geraldine to ask the final question. So Zach says, what tangible steps do you recommend for junior faculty beyond incorporating African-American scholarship into our own classes to change the nature of our departments, colleges, and universities, particularly if we are not in a position of authority or are pre-tenure? So what recommendations for junior faculty?
I want to be clear. I didn't start talking like this when I got tenure. I talked like this when I was a student, just didn't have as much evidence as I have now. So there's little magic waiting on tenure. We do this. So it's important to make alliances. So that's what being Black at Penn State was meant. So folks can write being Black at other places. You don't have to be Black to do it. A colleague who says, I observed this happening to a Black colleague. This is part of being Black at et cetera, et cetera. There was a white colleague who wrote that. And that's excellent, because that's how you change white folks are going to change white supremacy. And that was the example of the white students I said who were not invited. They came on their own volition to change it. You know exactly what white racism is. You know, it's the reason why you don't invite people home when Aunt Mary is there or when Uncle Joe is there. You know exactly what it is. So I don't waste my time with folks trying to act like they're discovering stuff. White folks know exactly what white racism is. So that's why I don't spend my time talking about race. I give you a definition of racism and then move on. It's the functional form of racism in their environment, whether they respond to it or not. Okay. So one is you make alliances with respect to publishing and teaching. I strongly recommend to you the teaching syllabus that I have, where the students write 2 to 3 page essays. I do not inflate grades. This will probably get me in more trouble than even my orientation towards specific scholarship. They write 2 to 3 page essays. I don't inflate grades. I have no group projects. I prepare a lecture. I don't have, again, I don't put the class in a circle. I read every word they write. I mark it up. Most students, I have a class, it's 45 papers come in. There may be 3 papers that earn a passing grade. The next week, there may be 3 again. The next week, there's probably 6. It's probably about the 4th week where they see that this guy is serious. And then maybe there are about 6 or 7 that pass. By the 5th week, they can revise 1 paper out of that first 5. Many of the students leave. instead of looking at me and saying, why do students leave my course? I know why they leave my course. It's not just the subject matter, but because it's rigorous. You should be looking at what courses do they go to? These blow-off courses where the grades are inflated. I share with students, your grade inflation will hurt you like monetary inflation. You thought you had 10 grand in the bank, you got 2 grand. Your writing will represent you more than your physical presence will in life. So this is what you do when you go to the career fair. You tell them, you say, like, look here, look at you got my transcript, look, you see my GPA. I don't walk on water. I took Henderson's classes, so you know I don't have a very high GPA. But he said, I tell you what, if you give me your last year's annual report in 15 minutes, I'll write a response to it that I think will impress you. My students can do that because I teach them to write effectively. 2 to 3 page essays. And students say, well, Dr. Henderson, I said by the 4th week, I've read more of your work probably than any other professor on this campus. I said, the 4th week? It can't be a word over 3 pages, at most 12 pages? How can you? I've written 30-page papers. Nobody read them. Who read them? It's one reason the students haven't attacked me yet, haven't shot me yet, because they know when they look at that paper as marked up in his ears, say, as much as Dr. Henderson said, that man read every word I wrote. He commented on everything I wrote. I've been in my office to 2 and 3 in the morning. It's not a requirement. 2 and 3 in the morning helping motivated students write well. See? So I'll send you my syllabus so you can see. All the essays, the 2 to 3 page essay questions, the thesis are on the essay at the beginning of the year. Truth in packaging, I give it to them right up front. And I share with students, all my courses beyond the intro course, which is just 3 multiple choice tests. All my courses involve writing these weekly essays. This is undergrad. Grad students write reviews. Let me say something quick, because I take this very seriously. My intro class is 3 multiple choice tests. I have a review session before each test. I don't review the material. I review the test. You see? I say these words exactly. You're responsible for every word uttered in lecture, every word written in required reading. Having said that, I suggest you focus on the following. I look down at papers that look like a test, and I tell them what they should prepare for. Why? I say, in your professional life, you're going to know the criteria by which you're going to be evaluated. Could I write a test that no one could pass? Sure, but that's not fair. I write a test so that half of the questions, you should be able to be barely conscious to get half the questions right. What's the logic of that? Well, 50%, that's a failing grade, right? So you should be able to be barely conscious to get half the questions right. Then I write questions that allow me to differentiate a failing performance from a poor one. A poor one for average, for want of a better word. Just thinking of what the C represents. Then average to good, good to excellent. Excellent. That means only 10% of my questions should require an excellent response. I've never had an A student. I've never had a B student. I've never had a C student, a D student, or an F student. I tell them, these grades are not your identity. I've had students that had an A performance. I've had students that had a B performance. So I get them to separate themselves from these grades. They got grade inflation at Princeton and Harvard. You're not at Princeton and Harvard. But I tell you what, in the different places I've been, though the credit belongs to these undergrads, I've sent people to Princeton and Harvard, you see? What, they're writing. We know that. And I had a colleague, of course, nobody here, but I had a colleague, this one student, it's really troubling. They just can't, subject, verb, predicate. They were having a lot, and English was their native language. I told a colleague, I said, that they're having real problems with writing. And they said, who? I told them the name. They said, oh yeah, he can't write. I never talk like that. I never say my students can't write. There's no such thing as, I'm not a writing person. No, somebody trained you to believe that. Folks think they have a learning disability when they've been confronted with teachers with teaching disabilities. That's what they got. They got one mode to teach, no other modality. Okay, anyway, it said, I told the name, they said, yeah, it can't. I said, why would you say that? He said, well, they were in my class last semester. I said, yeah, I'm struggling with that. Went back to my office and I realized I didn't ask the most pertinent question. I came back. I said, what grade did they get? He said, an A. So that student got an A. So now the student takes my class and is convinced I have a problem. He said, Dr. Henderson, what is it that you want? I want the standard rules of written composition. You know those things I made up last night. There's no requirement for spoken English, but for written English, yes. So to develop your analytical skills. So I would send it to your former students, Taylor, because this is so important that the students have that on their syllabus and I evaluate them, start off each one with summarized Walt's main arguments from Steve Walt's important article. So it's important that we don't wait for activism. It's not required. You just want to show a different perspective on what led to World War I. That's why you have Du Bois. There's also, do you remember the Eulenburg scandal prior to World War I? A supposed gay scandal where the Kaiser had gone soft because he had these gay advisors. It's called the Eulenburg scandal. Well, that's what I include in my foreign policy class, because that was a prominent factor in the onset of World War I. The Kaiser wanted to show his greater manliness in that sense, okay? The Eulenburg scandal. So I'm saying you can incorporate these there. They're hidden in plain sight. Don't mystify it. Don't make it difficult. Look at those of us who are doing these types of things and take them just as points of departure. You don't have to adopt it. It doesn't fit you, but take it as points of departure and do what I'm doing now. Share it with others. Share it with others. There's a broader community than what you may see even at the place you're at.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henderson. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. It's been incredible. The last hour and a half, I felt like I've been back in the classroom with you. Thank you. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to learn from you. I apologize that we did not get to everyone's questions. We've just run out of time, unfortunately, but please, let's continue the discussion on Twitter, LinkedIn, other social media, other resources that you have access to. By way of wrapping this up, I want to quote a comment from one of today's attendees. This comment is from Kelly Jo Bloom. Kelly Jo is a PhD candidate in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also the editor of Millennium, the Journal of International Studies. She writes, "Thank you so much, Professor Henderson. I just wanted to share with the audience who might be less aware in the US what a profound impact your work, your publications, and has had in British international relations. Professor Henderson's publications are among our most read and engaged pieces of all time." She's talking about her journal, Millennium. "Your work indeed informs our own practices at the journal and to resist white supremacy within the academy. Professor Henderson has been invited to be a plenary speaker at 2 of our annual conferences, and at last year's conference, his talk literally brought the whole room to a standstill. The same thing happened today. I just wanted to acknowledge this role and how important you have been for the intellectual milieu here, our political work, and the journal. I can't think of any better way to end. Finally, a lot of people worked really hard to make today's presentation a success. Among them, I'd like to thank Sandy Monteverde, the Assistant Director of the Ridgway Center, and Diane Cohen, Assistant Director of the Ford Institute. Sandy and Diane worked tirelessly to make today's talk such a success. I also want to thank Taylor, Geraldine, and Jillian Royal, one of our other second-year students here at GISPIA, who was involved in talks in bringing this about. I also want to thank GISPIA's new dean, Professor Carissa Slaughterback. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Ariel Armani, Vice Provost for Global Studies at Pitt and the Director of the University Center for International Studies. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you most of all to you, Errol. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. It's just been such a fantastic experience. And I hope that this is the beginning of a broader discussion as opposed to the end. You've given us a lot to think about, and you've given us a lot to improve upon. So thank you, Errol.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
That concludes our talk today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.